Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to discuss with you a source analysis question now about our studies on the Peninsular War. We, of course, covered several parts about it. We looked at Wellington, we looked at all the various battles throughout the era that focused on him, Salamanca, Vittoria, Torres Vedras. But now it's time for us to actually consolidate it and put it into examination practice. This will be really helpful for you out there for studying this for an examination, especially those of you doing A-level content. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So in this one, we're going to look at source analysis. And again, I will stress this is for the A-level standards. So again, how you analyze a source differs slightly with how you do it at GCSE, and especially how it's worded for, of course, A-level inquiries. So I hope you're going to find this quite useful. And what we're going to look at in this video is the British experience in the Peninsular War. I'll give you an overview of how we exactly answer a source, what it tends to be like, the structure of how we find it in an examination, and then we'll go over how we actually could answer a practice source question in this video. So first let's consider what exactly is a primary source. Well, a primary source quite literally is something that was created at the time. It can take many forms. It can be a speech, something written down like a diary or a journal entry. It can be pictures, or it can even be physical objects from that era. Again, I always like to think like look at something in your own room or in your classroom, that kind of thing. Something in there could be a historical primary source in 100 to 200 years' time. Maybe a TV, maybe a book, maybe even your bed, maybe a picture you have on the wall. That could all be a primary source in years to come. But for our examination, we have to consider how exactly primary sources will be used. And they'll be used in the same way for all of them. This is roughly the same for the majority of exam boards, which is you have a primary source given to you and it'll be split up into three parts. You'll have the inquiry. Literally, this is basically the question. This is what the examiner wants you to do with the source. It'll be to look at something like value or usefulness, how you could use the source to understand or inform someone about an event, topic, or thing. The second part will be the actual content. This is the literal source itself. At A level, it will pretty much always be a block of text. It'll be a couple of paragraphs, maybe even a full page for some exam boards. So you'll have to read, have to pick some parts about, and then use to answer the inquiry. And the final part will be the problem. It's a little bit shorter. It's typically a blurb, and the examiner is in some ways trying to be kind to you. They understand that if they just picked a random source, it can be quite a lot to read a source and have to figure out, especially in an exam condition with so little time, what the source actually talking about, where it's from, that kind of thing. So the examiners are kind and they just tend to tell you. They can say, this is the source from 2025. It was published on YouTube by a YouTuber named History with Sire, who was telling students around the world how to answer a primary source question. It'll just tell you that quite literally, which in some ways is good because it takes away a bit of the mystery of the source, makes it a bit more understandable. But in some ways it's also negative. I know in my students, it leads a lot of you to focus less on the skill of inference and more someone just telling stuff because the examiners have already told you something. But we'll have a look now at a primary source and how we could go about answering it. So first off, how exactly do we analyze a primary source? And the structure I recommend for this is something called tickling a source. Quite literally, I want you to tickle a source. Now, what this literally means is it's basically a 5-point strategy. So much like our teal structure for an essay, we're going to always look at our topic sentence, go back to the inquiry. What was it talking about? Oh, it's about the Peninsular War and it's about everything that happened at Salamanca. So how does this source help us answer the question about the Battle of Salamanca? So you've got to make sure everything you do in your paragraph is going to focus around that idea. The second one is infer. This is a tough skill, but I think it's one once you get it, it's really good to have. And it's drawing inferences from a source. So a quick example, let's say someone was walking outside with an umbrella up. You can infer from that it must be raining because the person's got a raincoat on, the umbrella's up, and they're therefore trying to keep dry. That's an inference. I don't know that it's raining. I can't see the clouds. I can't see any rain, but I can infer that it is raining because of something that person is doing. And this is the exact same way of how we'll use a source. Once you can do the inference for source analysis, that's really what examiners want to see. The content and knowledge is great, but it doesn't mean much if you can't infer and prove to us that it came from the source. Again, you're not just telling me stuff. We want to connect your knowledge with the source, and that's what's so important about the inference skill. Which then gets us on to our other two part, which is the content. So the content is literal quoting, and these quotes are the evidence for where you've got your inference from. So if someone said in the source, I really love history, well, you're going to pick that out to show that this person is passionate. That's the quote you're going to choose from someone's personal statement because that's what they're talking about and that's what they're saying. And this is why you then need knowledge. You need the knowledge now to bring in and support that inference. And then this is where your context makes or breaks the essay. Verbal example to link it together. So we had our content there. This person really loves history, and the knowledge I could bring in to prove that, oh, they must love history because they've watched all of History with Science videos since they've been released throughout this academic year. Shameless plug, I know, but that's the evidence that you'd be wanting to show to prove this inference is correct. And the final part is then linking back. Again, much like any essay, you have a big paragraph of information, maybe a full side of A4 long. You need to then link that back to the question to remind the examiner, oh, I've told you all this wonderful context because I was talking about how brilliant history is as a subject, whatever it might have been. And therefore, you've got to link it together and keep it connected. The best answers will probably have several inferences, and four of them will be expanded into full substantial paragraphs. Again, do bear in mind this depends on your example's timings. Again, sometimes it could be 45 minutes, you may get an hour for this question. Maybe it's an extensive one where it's the whole paper, full hour and a half, 2 hours. So you've got to be really clear about that, the time you've got for this essay. But if we're going to estimate you're going to get 45 to 50 minutes on this question, I reckon four substantial paragraphs with a conclusive judgment for how useful or valuable it is would indeed suffice for a full answer to an A-level source question. The second part of a source to analyze is the provenance. So we looked at our content there, what's actually said, what we can infer, but a source is going to have provenance as well. And we have to ask ourselves this very simple question. Does the source have no pals? Now, no pals can be broken up into this nature. The nature of a source, basically, what is the source? Think of your 5 W's for this kind of thing. So, what is the source? Is it a diary, a logbook, a letter, a speech? And this is so important, right? So, you know it's a diary entry. What can we infer from that? Why is it important that this is a diary entry that only the person writing it would have been intended to read? That's one to consider. The other one is the origin. When and where was it made? So, for instance, for our Peninsular War, as we'll look in a second, was this made in the middle of a battle? Was this made by someone reflecting afterwards? Was this made before the battle? Was it made on the battlefield or someone in a village who watched the battle? That kind of origin really determines the interpretation of the source it's going to give and the presentation of the history that it's recalling. The third one is the purpose. This is so important. Why was this source created? Why would someone have gone up in their fleeting time on this earth, have gone about to say these words, to write them down, to make sure this can be passed on to the next generation? Does that mean they deemed it so important to know about? Was there a hidden agenda? Had they manipulated any facts? Are they being as truthful as possible? Why would they not be? You have to consider that. That's why purpose is so important. And the penultimate one is audience. Who is the intended audience? Like sort of diary entry. Is it private? Is only one person going to read it? Or is it a public speech? People want to know about this. The speaker wants this to be heard. How could that affect the value of the source, knowing what its intention and who it's for? And then, much like our tickle, make sure once you've asked if it's got no pals, you link back to the question and answer that. Do we have a nature, origin, purpose, and audience that is therefore useful and valuable for this question? I would strongly recommend as well when you're doing the provenance paragraph, you probably do this at the end. I would strongly recommend when you do look at provenance, you probably should do this at the end of an essay, as like your penultimate paragraph before your conclusion, because I think a lot of students get so fixated on just telling, oh, the source told me it was by Wellington and he wrote about the Battle of Salamanca, therefore it's perfectly valuable. You know, that's not great analysis. The content itself is much more important than who said it, when it was said, where, why. You should look at provenance as like the sauce on a sandwich put on a pizza. It's great, but it adds to what's already there. It's not necessarily the base, the actual pizza base that the whole essay is built around. Something to bear in mind when you're answering your questions. There we are, very good. So now we've considered exactly how we analyze the source. Let's actually give one a go. Here we go. So I've given you a full source here. Again, it's a full block of text. I'm not going to read it all to you. This is the part of the video where I would strongly recommend that you pause it now and have a read of this yourself. Assess the value of this source for an inquiry into the nature of warfare in Portugal, October 1810. So as I said, I would strongly recommend you pause the video now, have a full read of this source, maybe jot down some ideas yourself, maybe take time now to consolidate your notes across this series and from your wider reading to help you answer this. What can you generate of yourself. What can you infer from this source? Maybe 10, 15 minutes, maybe 20, with plenty of time for you to really gather from that. In an examination setting, you're probably going to have no more than 5, if you want extra time, maybe 10 minutes to really go into that. So it's strongly recommended we really put our practice in now so you know what you're doing later. So pause the video and I'll see you in a few minutes to go over what I have and how maybe it links with what you've gathered in your preparation. Ready? Okay, let's do it. Let's have a look how we answer this question. So first off, let's look at the actual inquiry. It's assessed the value of this source into the nature of warfare in Portugal, October 1810. The examiner wants us to inform them how useful this source is for learning about a topic. And the topic in particular is the nature of warfare. So what exactly does that mean? It literally means what fighting happened, how did it happen, what tactics were used, any battles that took place, were there any key decisions, and of course, what was the general experience? Again, it's important to note here, it's not said the nature of British warfare or British experience. So again, we're in Portugal. It's told us Portugal. You can make reference to civilian experience as well. You can think, how did this warfare affect the people who live there, not just those who fought there? And of course, by talking about Portugal, October 1810, linking your contextual knowledge, you should be able to figure out that this is not only the Peninsular War, Wellington's own retreat to the lines of Torres Vedras that he had his Portuguese sappers construct in 1809. So therefore, this is part of that big wider campaign, and the source should hopefully illuminate to us about that particular campaign especially. So therefore, we should make sure our answer considers these things and therefore focus on answering the question throughout. Our second part that's given to us is the provenance. As I said, probably deal with this at the end of the essay when you actually write it. But if you want for your planning, you can still consider it and, of course, jot down some notes. Something you may have noticed straight away is this is by Sergeant William Lawrence. So it's by a British sergeant in the war, and therefore this is the clear British perspective we can explore. So that's something to really bear in mind whose vision of the war we're getting right now. It's not the Portuguese, it's not the Spanish, and not the French. It's the British sergeant's perspective. It's also from October 1810 and was written in Lisbon. So, because of the time and the geography of where and when it was made, we should be therefore fully aware this is vitally relevant for our source. If we want to learn about war in Portugal in 1810 October time, this can't get any better than a sergeant recalling events that happened in the capital city of the country in the very month this conflict occurred. We also know that he's recalling the retreat, so we can already infer that it's probably going to be about Torres Vedras, and it's therefore going to be about Wellington's tactics of that tactical retreat, scorched earth policy straight away. So again, what content we're going to find in the source, we can provenance is going to support us when we certify that as something that very much did happen. So that's our provenance. Let's look at the actual tickle sources and quotes you may pick out. I'm going to give 3 in this video, but again, you can certainly try and find more. And of course, pick out more closely than me. I'm going to take out chunks of the paragraph. When you write the essay, a sentence, maybe a few words, would perfectly suffice to draw your inference from. So this is one inference I got from the very first paragraph. Quite literally, we have Wellington's own proclamation of orders. So we know straight away, we can infer the nature of war that happened was a full-scale retreat for the British. That's literally what happened. All the inhabitants fell back and therefore had to flee the approaching advance from the French. We know Massena's on the way. He's been pushing Wellington's forces back from northern Portugal, and now he's retreating to the southern Portugal, expecting to reach his defences and put up a better fight. We can also note how Wellington gave the order to destroy any articles they might possess, and therefore we can infer from this that the nature of war on show here is scorched earth. Wellington's using scorched earth tactics to destroy anything the French could use for their supplies. And we know for a fact that when Massena gets to this land, he's going to be very frustratingly not going to have the supplies he needs. The French really relied on living off the land which they conquered. It was a brilliant way Napoleon marshals were able to fly far ahead of their supply wagons, so they could just live off the land they took over. But by literally destroying it, it removes any use to the enemy, and therefore the French really struggling to get very frustrated by this. And you can even maybe factor in to why this is the reason Massena struggles when he attacks Madras in the following weeks. The second tickle you may point out is actually the reference to civilians. Again, nature of warfare is not just soldiers, it's the people and the land in which it takes place in. We are told here that there are crowds of miserable men, women, and children. And so we can gather that this is a very bleak experience for the Portuguese that are living here. It's affecting them all. It's not just the soldiers. and therefore we can really focus on that. We can point out how, of course, how the French had all the barbarities of an atrocious enemy. If any of you have gone away and done the wider reading about Goya's disaster, the war, you'll know that the French indeed were quite atrocious. They were torturing, they were committing their own campaign slaughter against them, they were imprisoning, enslaving. And this is the big reason why, as miserable as these people are now, they would much rather flee and fall back with the British and Portuguese armies than they would stay there and face the onslaught and oppression of the French to come. So again, that's a thing you can point out there with the soldiers' experience, but also civilian experience as well. And the third and final tickle I'll give to you is Torres Vedras itself. It is quite rightly mentioned there. They make it there after a tedious, impressive march, and they take up the positions on some fine breastworks. These breastworks are the three line structure you should remember me having talked about. There's three section trench layers and redoubts that were therefore perfectly built to defend them against the French attack. And so you can focus on that as a key of warfare tactic as well, which is Wellington's defence in depth, using the miles, the 30 plus miles of distance that the Torres Vedras provides him and his men to draw out Massena, weaken his troops. And indeed, the source goes to back that up, as it says there, Massena was rather surprised at the British strength, and therefore he eventually retreats and has to concede, and he gives up on trying to break through because it's just so strong and so deep to break through. And again, you can make a link to how this is a big part of Wellington's style of war and how successful it proves against Massena. This combination with scorched earth that counters Massena's efforts to press and win the offensive. So there we are, there's three tickles that I managed to bring out, three key inferences you can make. There are more, of course, it's a very big source. For the sake of this video, we'll look to wrap this up now. And so now we have to give our judgment. What exactly is the value of this source for an inquiry into the nature of warfare in Portugal in October 1810? And for my money, I dare to say this is a very valuable source. We have clear reference to various tactics like scorched earth, Wellington's tactical retreat, and we can see the clear scale of the war as it affects not just Britain, but also its allies as well, with the Portuguese and the civilian population. The Provenance too supports this further. Its timing to the conflict, it is written in October 1810, probably very shortly after the retreat had occurred. We have a clear British perspective, so we have a clear side we can look at there. And of course, it directly references retreats that we know did happen, the lines of Torres Vedras, and of course, implicit reference to the atrocities the French were indeed committing. There are some arguable limitations. Again, it's the British perspective, so we don't have the exact, we don't have the civilian experience from those Portuguese. We don't hear from them what it's actually been like, and we also don't have Massena's word. We don't know from this source how he truly reacted and how he truly felt and what his plans were and that kind of thing. Yes, our contextual knowledge can bring in and bolster that up. Maybe it's a limitation to consider that it's just one perspective, and therefore, like any historian should say, we need more evidence, more sources to truly understand what happened across this war in Portugal in October 1810. But for the sake of you having maybe 40 minutes to an hour to write this answer, I think concluding it's very valuable with very minor limitations will be a perfect summation to make. I'm not mentioning limitations much because I think it's always much easier to agree with the question. If the examiner said there is value in this source, you're going to have a much easier time finding that value than you are trying to pick it apart and make limitations. Again, the weakest ones are indeed arguments of omission. There's no real evidential warping of information. There's no sense of deceit or lies. So therefore, it's just easy to agree and say it's very valuable. So finally, to wrap this video up, let's just quickly go over and summarize what we have learned about source analysis. We have to make sure we consider our inquiry. You have to answer the question. You can't just tell me context or repeat words from the source. Yes, you can quote, that's very important, but you should be giving me clear answers to the question. How is it valuable for the inquiry given? You can definitely try and follow tickle. Inferring before context is the most important skill though. If you don't necessarily use tickle for a paragraph structure, just remember, you get a quote, you infer knowledge, and then you give your contextual knowledge. That order is so important. If you don't have inferences before your context, then your context is unable to support it. I strongly recommend as well you focus on the content more than the provenance. Definitely try and develop lots of inferences from that before you focus on provenance and make sweeping statements like, oh, it's from Wellington, therefore it's perfect. You need inferences with evidence before provenance really matters. And lastly, value is the most important thing of all. If you don't have value, you're not answering the question. Yes, there may be some limitations, but value is the most important thing and should be used throughout your essay. And lastly, maybe you want to go and give this a go yourself. You can happily go away and write a paragraph answer, maybe turn my notes into a full one first, or develop your own inference and help out that way. Again, you happily have some wider reading you could go away and use as well. For instance, you may also find that a different inquiry can be used for the exact same source. So you have the exact same source we just looked at there together, but this time explain Wellington's success throughout the Peninsular War. Oh, that's a lot different now. Because now it's not just how the war was fought, it's Wellington's own actions. Yes, we have Torres Vedras there, and we have tactical retreats. But could we say there was clear proof of this in other campaigns of the war? Well, yes, there is. Those course lines of Torres Vedras, they don't just disappear after 1810. They are there for many years after. They also have tactical retreats are used at other campaigns, especially at Salamanca, Rodrigo, Badajoz. You can happily bring in those campaigns as well to support you. And again, throughout the Peninsular War, there's no need to keep it locked in 1810. You can go before that, way back to 1808, or beyond that to 1813 and maybe early 14 as well. The last thing I'll say as well is try and find other sources too. Ask your teachers, do you have any primary sources about the Peninsular War? Or maybe you're doing the naval part, maybe ask for primary sources about Nelson, about actions at Trafalgar, whatever it might be. The more practice you can do by reading and analyzing a lot of different sources, the better your inferences become and the more sharp you are with recalling your contextual knowledge that you need to help answer these questions effectively. But there we are. That's exactly how we answer source analysis at the A level standard. Again, this is more so for the A level. GCSE, this is still useful, but it may be a bit more in depth than you necessarily will need. All the same, I hope you've enjoyed this video series so far. Make sure you like, commenting, and subscribing. Your support and engagement is always appreciated. What's the most fascinating thing you've learned so far in our series? Maybe about how you analyze source. Is it tickling a source? Is it something else? I'll let you be the judge. Make sure you let me know in the comments below. I look forward to seeing you in our next video on this series, where we're going to look at last, the magnum opus of Wellington and our final major battle, which is the Battle of Waterloo. We've reached the end of the French War era, trying to find out exactly how it all ends. I look forward to seeing you soon in our next video. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.